Good morning. Thank you for coming today. We've got quite a program for you. We have colleagues here from New York Times Magazine, from the OSCE monitoring mission in Ukraine, from the Bellingcat group in England, and from Corrective. We're here to talk about the shoot-down of Malaysian airliner 17 on July 17 last year. I remember that day vividly because within 20 minutes of the shoot-down of the airliner, I saw something in the media that FSB Colonel Gierkin Strelkov had put up something announcing with some satisfaction the shoot-down of a quote-unquote military plane. And of course, since there were no reports of the shoot-down of a military plane, it was pretty clear what had happened. I was in Berlin a week and a half after that, and I learned a new phrase as I was preparing to go to Berlin called Putinversteher, which meant people who understood sympathetically Mr. Putin and his policies, which is something that characterized the German political system and society pretty much through the summer, before and up through the summer of 2014. And in our conversations with Germans at that time, we were told that we could feel the residue of Putinversteher as we discussed the Kremlin aggression in the east of Ukraine. But a high German official, someone who had worked with me in Moscow when I was a diplomat in the mid-'80s, said to me that the German public was becoming quite concerned about what was going on surrounding the remains of the airliner. The reports, if you recall, of the looting of the bodies, the fact that the bodies were left in place for days and days, and in fact weeks. And she said to me, you know, if this is how the authorities there, meaning the folks in charge in the Russian-occupied parts of, or Russian-controlled parts of eastern Ukraine, if that's how they treat their dead, how do they treat their living? And that, in a phrase, highlights how the shoot-down of MH17 was a turning point in the war of ideas, or the war of understanding in Europe about the Kremlin-led aggression in Ukraine's east. So that's the only point I wanted to make. I will introduce now the lady who will moderate today's events, Yulia Yoffe, who is a Russian-American journalist and blogger who works right now at the New York Times Magazine. I first recall encountering her, not personally, but in writing for things she wrote in the New Republic, I believe. But she has also written and worked for Foreign Policy and the New Yorker. And her articles have also been featured in the Columbian Journalism Review, the Washington Post, Forbes, and elsewhere.
Thank you all for coming this morning. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. I think we can all remember where we were a year ago, and I think we're all having a similar feeling this morning that it's hard to believe that it's only been a year. The first images that we saw that day were horrifying, bodies raining down on this village that had already been, part of an active war zone. And then the news just grew only more horrifying, the looting of the bodies, the meddling with the crime scene. And a year later, the situation, it seemed like a game changer at the time, that something so horrible couldn't, and seemingly random, couldn't change the course of events in the conflict in Ukraine. And a year later, the situation does look profoundly different. I would argue that the event helped shape European resolve to get behind more robust sanctions, and that coupled with a precipitous economic decline in Russia really froze the conflict in place. I think Russia was willing and ready to go further in eastern Ukraine to take Mariupol and maybe hack a land route to Crimea, which it was finding difficult to supply. And instead, we have this strange conflict, this no man's land in the Donbass. Nobody seems to want this region anymore. And I feel like that the way the conflict stands in Ukraine now can be traced back to that morning 1 year ago when these poor people flying home or on vacation were just shot out of the sky. It's been, as we all know, part of a fight over basic facts and what happened, and we'll hear from speakers today whose work and diligence has tried to keep people focused on what are actual facts, what are actual images, to try to keep the narrative focused on what actually happened rather than a muddying of the waters and a devolution into, I don't know, an epistemological gray zone, no man's land. So without further ado, I'm going to let you guys take over.
Good morning. It's a real honor to be here today alongside some fantastic... my name is Igor Stanyan. I'm a contributor to Bellingcat. We've been doing some investigation in relation to MH17, and I would like to talk to you about one of the central things that we were able to find in the report that we produced in November last year. So on the slide there, you'll be able to see an image produced by journalists at Paris Match. This was of a Buk missile system outside of Donetsk on the 17th of July last year. And this was really the starting point for something that I worked on last year as well. And this was something that we used in our investigation. There were numerous images and videos taken by local people in the Snizhny and Taurus area and in occupied separatist-controlled territory in Ukraine, geolocating these images and videos, so being able to compare their location with open sources like Google Street View and Google Satellite View, meant we could identify that this was separatist-controlled territory. And this also meant that we could prove that the separatists had a book on that particular day in their possession. There was also a video produced by the SBU that showed a Buk missile system with at least one missile missing the day after the attack, seemingly returning back to Russia. In September last year, I started doing some investigation for Bellingcat that would later evolve into a report that we would collectively produce, and it was a real privilege working with our contributors. And I'll just talk to you a little bit about how it was able to discover that the book that shot down MH17 had actually come from Russia and had actually come from a specific military unit in Russia. So this was one of the first images I was able to find on Instagram just by searching for things like book in Russian. And what this shows is that at the end of June last year, there was a large column of military vehicles traveling through places like Stary Oskol, and this column had books in it. And it was quite an interesting image to find, because by narrowing down that particular time frame, it was possible to uncover more and more videos showing the same thing in different areas. It was possible to establish a kind of chronological order of the locations that this column had traveled in. This led me to find a particularly interesting video in a place called Alexeyevka, which was filmed by a local person, uploaded to the Russian website Kontakte, the Russian equivalent of Facebook, in June last year. And it was quite interesting because there was a book that was similar to what was seen in the Paris Match image. So there was a remnant of a number there that was quite similar to what was seen. And, you know, from what we know, the Russian military had been sending military equipment into Ukraine with numbers and identifying marks partially painted over. And this led me to find this particular image, which was a really important high-res image that had basically come from Instagram and was just uploaded by a local around Starioskul, just showing the book that downed MH17, that this was uploaded unwittingly by somebody weeks before the attack had actually taken place. So it was possible to go and make comparisons from there to on the left you see the image from Russia in June. On the right you see the image from outside Donetsk on the 17th of July. And there were numerous markings. It wasn't just the remnant of a number. It was actually an entire set of identifying features that showed that this was the same book, that this was irrefutable evidence that it had come from Russia. Alongside this, analyzing the number plates of the vehicles in that column was particularly useful because it had actually led to a particular unit in Russia that used the same area code and was armed with books. And it was actually possible to go and find I've contacted like a Russian Facebook page for Russian soldiers from a particular military unit, the 53rd Brigade in Kursk, Unit 32406, and look for the profiles of their soldiers. And it was possible then to get a confirmation. There was matching license plates of vehicles seen in the column traveling towards Ukraine, and those that they had uploaded themselves. And this was the contacted page that this had come from. So this was a really important link because it actually shown this column had originated from Kursk, which was also verified by other things. For example, the first chronologically ordered video that I was able to uncover was actually taken outside of Kursk. And it was possible to look at certain servicemen in that unit and analyze their images, and images that had shown that there was the link between that unit and the book that shot down MH17. And so the Bellingcat team, we started eventually looking at all these similarities. We started looking at the way the number was ordered, the damage to the side skirt of the book. These are basically bits of rubber over the tracks of the book, and we were able to confirm 100% that this was the same vehicle. And we tried to use other things as well. So, for example, this is an image from a Russian forum for the wives, mothers, relatives of Russian soldiers, and this was actually a post relating to somebody related to somebody in the unit. And they were saying that this unit was being sent towards Ukraine to the Russian border to a place called Milerovo, and this post in itself had meant that we were able to uncover more videos, for example, from places like Milerovo, showing that the unit had gone there at that time. So these were, just a number of different things that could, verify that the unit had actually traveled towards Ukraine at that time, weeks before MH17 was shot down. And as well as that, by looking closely at the posts on that forum, the relatives, it was then possible to go and actually find images from within that column, posted by soldiers from that unit, and it was possible to again, gain further confirmation that this actually did take place, this actually happened. And in the end, what we were able to do was essentially, build up a chronological order of what had happened, when it took place, and map out the exact route taken by the convoy. And this in turn allowed us to then look at the dates after the attack, and we were similarly able to find that there was some movement of books belonging to exactly the same unit, actually going back to the unit after the attack had taken place. So, I feel tremendously privileged to have worked with the Bellingcat team to uncover this, and I'm proud to present this work to you today, and I hope that you know, those of you that haven't seen it will, you know, see the MH17 report that we produced, and you know that hopefully this will then add to the narrative of what had happened on the day. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Iggy. We're now going to give us 1 second. We're beaming in David Crawford of the investigative journalist group Corrective from Berlin that has put out the other hard-hitting Hi, David. We're on. How are you?
Hi. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, I'd like to explain something about what we were trying to do at Corrective. Corrective is a non-profit investigative newsroom. We're funded by a German foundation that was created as part of the legacy of the founders of the Westdeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, the Brost Foundation. So what we need to do are investigations that are in the public interest. We do stories when there's something important to say. We want to do stories where the readers will say, I didn't know that. And we try to create a positive impact for change. So when we started this story, we had to look at it, what could we say that would be in the public interest? And we thought that this was a story that could be done in the public interest because there was a war going on in eastern Ukraine, and part of it, and it was accompanied by a war of words in which the MH17 disaster played an important role. So we thought that what we should try and do is to fact check the information that was about it and try to create or to put together information that people could rely on. So we started reviewing statements initially by the Russian government, the Ukraine government, separatist leaders, the Netherlands investigators, the OSCE, the US government, NATO, the German government, of course, since we're based in Germany. And initially we looked for facts that everybody agreed on. And one of the facts that everybody, surprisingly enough, agreed on was that if it was shot down by a ground-to-air missile, it had to be a book, a type of missile that was initially built in the Soviet Union and then in Russia. And everybody, the US government said it had to be a book. The Russian government said if it was a ground-to-air missile, it had to be a book. The Ukrainian government was saying that. Everybody seemed to agree on that. So we were looking for different information in this part. But we also discovered something very strange in our investigation. And Iggy, who you just heard, is part of that, because we realized that there was somebody else we had to be fact-checking, and that's Bellingcat. And for us, that was very, very strange, because here we had a whole bunch of countries or government institutions with very, very strong reputations, and all of a sudden we realized we had to be looking at a fairly new internet website called Bellingcat. And to our astonishment, we discovered that actually the information that Bellingcat was putting out there was really, to a large degree, more useful than many of the governments were doing, because they were making their data very transparent so anybody themselves could go and check it. And one of the first things that I did was went and visited Iggy in the Netherlands, and I said to him, how are you putting this together? How can I believe you? And he pulled out his tablet and he conjured up a Cyrillic scribboard keyboard for it, and he started just doing the different stuff that he was doing to put his information together. So very quickly realized that I had to take him seriously. So we actually put them on the same pedestal with all of these other institutions and decided that one of the problems, if Bellingcat has a weakness, one of its weaknesses is that it's new, and people generally are prone to say, okay, anything that appears in the internet you have to put in doubt. So we decided that we could start fact-checking things. And so we began to look at what everybody was saying. And we saw that the Russian government was saying that, first of all, they put out two different versions of the attack. They said that it could have been by a Buk missile fired by the Ukrainians, or it could have been done by an air-to-air missile. Well, you know, the two versions basically exclude one another. So in essence, what we felt was they were basically saying, we don't know. The Americans said that it was a Buk missile, but they didn't say how they knew that. They just said that they had intelligence information that they believed in. But this doesn't really help the discussion because for a lot of people, because they just say, okay, but you know, we would like to fact check this ourselves. So we began to try and look at other sources of information that we could use to fact check it. We did some of this similar stuff to what Iggy was telling you about. We actually ended up downloading entire websites of for example, a social media website of the 53rd Air Defense Brigade in Kursk. We just downloaded the entire website. We collected the profiles of as many soldiers as we could. We put them into a database, which included the email addresses and cell numbers of the soldiers so that we could call them and email them, because we thought that was something that we could do to add value to the story that other people weren't doing. We also began looking at the military logic of running air defense systems in Kursk, and that was something that we thought was missing from the discussion. Why are those missiles there? So we talked to military experts, air safety experts, air crash investigators, air traffic controllers. We reviewed satellite pictures. We created a map of the key locations, and we got ready to go and actually visit the locations. But one of the things that the military experts were telling us is that Buk missiles basically only have one function, and that is to protect Russian tanks. And they said that Russian tanks don't go anywhere without Buks. And when I decided to call the German Ministry of Defense and ask them what they thought about that, and the spokesman who I got on the phone, he said, "You don't need to tell me this." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "I am from tank units." He's a officer, a lieutenant colonel in the tank, from a tank regiment originally. He said, "We don't go anywhere without our air defense either. That it's a basic rule of the military combat strategy is that tanks can't protect themselves from air attacks unless they have ground-to-air missiles that they can take with them." So we began looking at that, and then we looked at what are these Buks and what can they, what are their strengths and failures. And one of the things that we learned was that Buks, basically, at least the Russian version of it, it's not able to differentiate between friendly aircraft and enemy aircraft, except for anything that is a Russian military aircraft is friendly, and anything that isn't, whether it's civilian or whether it's an enemy military, they all look the same to it. And we talked to aircraft controllers who said, you know, that when they start work each day, they go into a room, and first of all, they just stand there for 3 to 5 minutes, trying to get a three-dimensional image of the sky around them. And then when they think they have that picture, then they say to the person who was before them, in front of them in the shift, they said, "Okay, I've got it," and he would take over. But when we talked to Buk operators, people who had been trained in the Soviet Union, people who had been trained in Ukraine, they said to us they only have 40 seconds to get this picture, because within 40 seconds, you can't leave the radar of the Buk operating system on for more than 40 seconds. because the enemy planes can see your precise location based on this, and you're going to be destroyed. And so they began to tell us about a sort of a duel, like in the Wild West, where you have an airplane up here and a tank on the bottom. Both of them know that they're looking at each other. Both of them know they have the exact same location, or the locations of the other. And whoever shoots first has a much better chance of surviving. And so you have a situation where there's very, very little time, where you have opposing interests. Both groups want to survive. The pilots want to survive. The tank operators, the book operators want to survive. And there's very, very little time to make a decision. And we came to the conclusion that this was one of the big problems there, that you have a system that wasn't able to clearly differentiate between where civilian planes to them looked like enemy planes. And you had people who had to make a decision very, very quickly, or they themselves would die. And so this leads to mistakes. And we came to the conclusion that a mistake like this was bound to happen at some point, whether it was going to happen within 3 weeks before or 5 weeks after, we didn't know. But it wasn't a situation that was prone to run into lead to a disaster at some point. So, and then we started looking at, well, how does Russia make its decisions as far as these books were concerned? But we ended up having to look at this because when we were talking to soldiers in the unit, and when we were talking to other people, because we were phoning people from the 53rd Air Defense Brigade, and we're talking to people and writing them, what we heard was that these decisions are only of whether to fire a book missile is only made by officers. That the people who run these systems, they have 4 years at a military college. Basically, they're engineers, and that normal soldiers are not allowed to fire them. One person said to us that he had I think 4 months of training before he was even allowed to drive one of the trucks that pulls these systems around with them. And so these are very technical systems. Also, that the teams that run these systems have to work very closely together. You have different units. You have a launch ramp, which is mounted on the back of a tank. You have a radar system mounted on the back of a tank. You have a control center, which is within a tank, and then you have an assortment of other trucks and other vehicles. They all have to coordinate and operate together, and the teams, they have to be in constant practice. So this isn't activity that just could be outsourced to a bunch of separatist fighters who hadn't done this, who hadn't been to a technical university, who hadn't been training constantly for months using this system. And also the military logic, people were saying, look, generals aren't going, if you've got a team that's dedicated to defending tanks, who've been training for years to do this, who know how to do it, and you know that those tanks are expensive, the lives of your soldiers are at stake, then you're not going to outsource that to people who don't have the training, who don't know how to operate it, and may decide this is Tuesday and I'd rather go visit my mother-in-law than be there. So this is something that you don't outsource because you're defending the lives, and also the missions that these tanks are trying to serve also depend on it, and that's important to the general staff that is sending people into this war zone. So we were able to comfortably conclude that this operation could only have been run by regular soldiers, and we were able to, when we were fact-checking what Bellingcat was doing and looking at other information that we were finding, also the information that the various governments were concerned. For example, the Ukrainian government and the Russian government both agreed that the launch platform that Iggy was showing just a few minutes ago were what was actually in the region. They disagreed upon the exact location, but they agreed to within about 30 kilometers of another that this launch ramp was actually within the region. And we then actually went to the locations and were able to determine that the location cited by Bellingcat was actually correct. We also talked to separatist leaders who told us that that they needed air defense systems near Snizhny because of fighting that was going on there. The Ukrainian government had put out information that that it had destroyed tanks near Snizhny a couple of days before. And one of the separatist commanders whose interview with us we posted on our website, he said that they had to put the air defense to the north and to the west of Snizhny because he said, look, we didn't have, Russia was to the south and to the east, so we didn't need any defense there. We went to the north and to the east, and we found a little group of houses, about 60 houses there, where the town was basically traumatized. Everybody in this town knew what had happened. They knew that the missile had been launched from there. We talked to a lot of people who gave us bits and pieces of what were going on. We pieced it together, and we found also other people who were able to tell us a lot more, that they saw an object flying back past them that looked like an airplane but didn't have any windows, and there were a bunch of other things that they were telling us. And one person was able to say this was the missile that destroyed MH17. We also posted this interview on our website so people can look and see exactly what he was saying. We also found one of the civilian separatist leaders who basically took us inside the mind of the person who he said was firing the missile. He said this was a Ukrainian soldier who was firing a ground-to-air missile. The closer you got to the launch site, the more separatist leaders said it was a ground-to-air missile. Nobody within 10 kilometers of this site would say it wasn't a ground-to-air missile, because everybody knew. And this one civilian leader, he said, that the soldier was sitting there with wet hands. He was frightened. He only had a few seconds to make a decision. Is it an enemy? Is it not an enemy? Is it friend? Is it foe? And finally he decided he had to shoot it, and so he launched the missile. He claimed this was a Ukrainian soldier who was doing this, though why a separatist leader would have a conversation with a Ukrainian soldier. He was, though, in a position, because he was one of the senior civilian people in the area, to have said, I want to report about what exactly happened. We never got to the bottom of whether his story is true, but it fit in with what the military people who we were talking to was saying, of what they thought had happened. I'm not going to go into all of the stuff that Iggy was talking about. We basically looked at their sites and found that what he was saying about them was true. We also looked at other sites that the Russian government was talking about and found that Sorenska, for example, that the Russians said that there was a Buk missile launched from there, or at least the launch pads were there. We were able to determine, we talked to the people there, that nobody there had actually seen what the Russians purported was there. So what we basically tried to do was to get feet on the ground to actually go and look and talk to people as much as possible, to talk to people outside of Russia, or outside of the Ukraine, but also in the Ukraine to try and piece this together as much as possible. And then we try to put our information out as transparently as possible. And if you go to our website, you can see a great majority of the information is available to be downloaded, pictures, videos, audio. It's all there for people who want to fact check us. And we invite anybody who wants to. We put the exact address there of where we had found this. Anybody else can go there and talk to the people like we did. I think that's the way you have to verify what was going on. And I think I will finish up here. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you so much, David, for joining us all the way from Berlin. I would also just say a few words about why these two particular groups are the ones we invited here today. So Bellingcat, Corrective, I think, are great examples of how citizen journalism, investigative journalism can work together. So what Bellingcat was able to do, and these reports are available for you to pick up just right outside, both the Bellingcat and the Corrective reports. They were able to geolocate the positions of the launch site, trace the movement of the book, and what Corrective was able to complement to Bellingcat's work is to send people on the ground to actually verify this information with interviews. And these two reports together provide, I would say, incredibly compelling evidence of what actually happened on the ground and who was behind the MH17 shootdown. And now I would like to ask Michael Rachicchio to come up. Michael is the spokesperson for the OSCE. He was one of the first respondents on the ground last year during the shootdown of MH17. And I'd also like to remind all of you who are watching online to join the conversation with hashtag #ACUkraine. So Michael, with that, please.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'd really like to thank the organizers for inviting us here today. It's a real privilege, and especially on a day like today. I also want to start off by taking a brief moment. This is really, really important, of course, to pay tribute to the families of the victims. Just a few minutes ago, the mission in Kiev, the special monitoring mission to Ukraine, did come to a standstill. We took a moment of silence at exactly 4:20 p.m., 9:20 a.m. here to commemorate the 298 lost souls. And also in a statement today issued by our chief monitor, Ambassador Apakan, he said that this tragedy ended the lives of 298 people in the most horrific manner and left a deep scar among their loved ones in the Netherlands, Malaysia, Australia, and all over the world. This is a stark reminder of the heavy toll borne by civilians in this and all armed conflicts. The memory of the victims will stay with the Special Monitoring Mission monitors and remind all of us of our important task to contribute to normalizing the situation in Ukraine. Now, we're just going to pause for a moment, if we can, and run about 3 or 4 minutes of a video from Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. This was done by a dear friend and one of Canada's best investigative journalists, Susan Ormiston, who was one of the first on the scene on July 17th and 18th. And I think it's a good setup to also the work that the Special Monitoring Mission did. And I'll be right back after the video.
The wreckage was still smoldering when a small team from the OSCE got there. Michael Buchurku, a Ukrainian-Canadian, was thrust into the heart of the disaster to observe and report back to 57 countries, including Canada, but the team ended up doing much more. No other officials arrived for days. Buchurku and Alexander Hug became the eyes and ears of the world. We crossed paths many times. We finally found a calmer place and time to reflect. Michael, you've been here and out at that site almost daily for the last more than 10 days. What stands out for you amongst your observations about what happened?
What really hits you is how people's lives have been tragically and abruptly interrupted. There were a lot of people on that plane that were on their way out to vacation. The other day I found a piece of literature that looked like it was being carried to that AIDS conference in Melbourne. The most sad thing I think I saw was a note written by someone to themselves on the plane or on their way to the plane, and it says, one of the things I want to do is have a good vacation and not blow my budget, but yet have a good time. I mean, it's stuff like that really, really stays with you. If I can say on a personal level, we have become almost intimately familiar with that site. We've looked close up at personal belongings. We're able to notice and point out subtle differences. So, for example, going almost daily to the cockpit scene, that has been the most stark in terms of how it's changed. When we first arrived there, again, horrifying stench of death. The cockpit appears to have just slammed down into earth. It was pretty much intact. Over the days, we had seen that piece of cockpit kind of spread out like this. Day 2, I believe it was, there were actually men in uniform hacking into it with a power saw. They could have been involved in active body recovery or human remains recovery, we don't know. But even since then, I would say in the past 3 days, it's been spread out even more. The other striking things, of course, when we arrived here the day after, there were a lot of bodies just lying there, exposed to the elements. It was a horrifying scene. It was horrifying.
No one was sure who was in control of the bodies, left in the fields too long. Finally, they were collected and placed in refrigerated train cars for transport to Kharkiv.
The site was difficult, but the train was cold and lonely, and 2 days.
Cold and lonely and dark. When the Dutch forensic experts, there were only, I think, 3 of them came, they did the best they could to at least increase the level of dignity, if we can even put it that way. That was very, very difficult indeed. The one thing that has powered us through this is knowing that we're doing this for the families. That in this conflict zone, where there's no security to the site, where anything could happen, anything we could do to provide some semblance of order and process, that not only the bodies of the loved ones, but also their personal belongings and documents get back to the families. That was really important to us. The days for us have been very long. Under hot sun, we've seen horrific things that we'll never talk about to anybody else.
They spent more time than anyone mapping debris over 35 square kilometers. The team still reeling from a recent kidnapping and release of 8 of their monitors. All this in Bochurkyu's first 3 months in the job.
Do you sit back sometime and wonder how you landed in this hot spot at the start of your job?
I do, and you know, my roots do go back to Ukraine. I'm Ukrainian Canadian, and I've been here many times. I sometimes feel life may never be the same again.
Thanks for watching that. It still sends chills down my back to watch some of those images. The full report is available online if you want to have a look at that. Now, in the statement by Ambassador Apakan I just read, he did mention the heavy toll borne by the civilian population, and I think it's really important just to give you a quick snapshot, if I may, on the current security situation in eastern Ukraine as reported by our monitors. Excuse me, unfortunately, violence continues unabated, and the situation has deteriorated over the past weeks and months. Heavy weaponry continues to be moved around and utilized, and this is really a stark statistic. In the past week alone, almost 2,000 explosions have been recorded by our monitors in and around Donetsk airport alone. And by the way, while I'm reading, we have some file photos, I think, from the scene of the crash in our work there a year ago. Also, our monitors on the ground in Donetsk and Luhansk are monitoring the movement and use of heavy weaponry. Most recently, we've been monitoring the developing logistic capabilities of rebel groups. This involves things, for example, more concentration of ammunition, and military vehicles close to what appears to be functioning railway stations. As most of you know, we have drones, unmanned aerial vehicles in the air, and in previous weeks they've noticed a large concentration of military hardware in and around areas such as Komsomolsk. And, we're talking about things like main battle tanks, and we're also talking about sophisticated weaponry such as Strela surface-to-air missile systems our UAVs have seen. Also, there are many challenges to operating in such a conflict zone, and over the past few weeks, our UAVs have also been subject to systematic jamming of our video and GPS, and we're talking about very, very sophisticated military-grade jamming going on. Also, in terms of people on the ground, what we've also been observing is that the so-called DPR and so-called LPR have seemed not really able to provide for basic human and societal needs in the areas they control. For example, the judicial system there seems almost dysfunctional, where people who are under detention have to wait almost indefinite periods to be seen by a court. Now, our colleagues in the UN have been doing a fabulous job in terms of trying as best they can to document the toll on the civilians, and the numbers, again, very stark and horrifying. The latest numbers indicate, latest UN numbers indicate that almost 7,000, we're almost at that number there, almost 7,000 have been killed since the conflict began. And by the way, that number does include the victims of MH17. And in terms of number of people injured, almost 17,000. A number hard to believe, some 2.3 million people have been uprooted since the conflict began in April 2014. And this is an important number because remember, a year ago, Ukraine had virtually no displaced people, no displaced population. Now, according to the UN, Ukraine is in the list of the top 10 countries in the world with the largest number of displaced people. Amid all of this, people's livelihoods have been affected as industry and commerce is choked and access to supplies and markets are being increasingly cut off. We're often finding ourselves reporting on this situation at checkpoints on the front line, and people are forced to wait hours and sometimes days at checkpoints that unfortunately are subject to frequent shelling, or also very close to areas that are mined. Another huge, enormous problem is the lack of water. Constant shelling in many towns along the front line have rendered water pipes inoperable. And we've been very active recently in Horlivka, which is area north of DPR-controlled Horlivka, where we've been able to arrange for daylight mini ceasefires, which in turn has allowed access for repair workers and others to get the water flowing again, and this has potentially benefited 2.5 million people. Now, I mentioned a bit earlier the challenges to the mission, and we do continue to face unacceptable restrictions on our freedom of movement, and that's on both sides. Yet the special monitoring mission to Ukraine remains the main international instrument on the ground in Ukraine, and we will continue to conduct our impartial monitoring. By the way, our mandate has been extended up to March of next year. We've been present without interruption on both sides of contact lines since our inception, and will continue to do so. And by the way, at the moment we have around 500 monitors from over 40 different participating states. Now, just shifting quickly to MH17 is that one of the latest developments is that in late June, the mission was informed that the Dutch-led investigation team had to discontinue its mission, at least temporarily, due to lack of access in areas controlled by the so-called LPR. But up until then, the special monitoring mission had been facilitating access for experts and more recently investigators. We facilitated access for, as the photos indicate in the video, repatriation of human remains, of personal belongings, and of aircraft debris. And it was on November 14th where recovery work of the debris began, and now the main pieces are back in the Netherlands and are being reconstructed. Going back to the exactly 1 year ago today, so the mission was on the scene exactly 24 hours after the Boeing 777 came down. It was a horrific scene, as the video indicated, where parts of the aircraft were still smoldering, bodies laid out in the field, exposed to the elements, and incredibly, there was no perimeter security whatsoever. The first days were incredibly difficult. When we first arrived on the afternoon of the 18th, we were greeted, if we can put it that way, by a small group of rebels who really seemed trying to intimidate us and restrict our access. Fortunately, though, in the days after that, the access did improve, and we were able to facilitate access for experts from Ukraine, Malaysia, Australia, and the Netherlands. And it was during those first few weeks that we reported to the 57 participating states of the OSCE, and by extension to the world, via daily reports, spot reports, and countless media interviews. We also held many media scrums and press conferences out at the site of the crash, and also at the in Donetsk itself. And because Ukrainian media, in principle, couldn't access areas that the rebels controlled, what we also did from the crash site is we held many remote briefings to the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center in Kiev. And by the way, the lack of access for Ukrainian journalists is very much in play to this day in rebel-controlled areas. I also wanted to note, as a kind of footnote, is that where the plane came down and where the railway station was in Torres, up until then, it was a no-go zone for us. And the reason for that is it's exactly the same area where 4 of our colleagues were kidnapped several weeks earlier. They were held for a month, and fortunately were released unharmed and unconditionally just a few weeks before MH17 came down. The other important fact I wanted to point out is many of you have probably heard of the Trilateral Contact Group. This is a group that includes senior representatives from Ukraine, from the Russian Federation, and the OSCE. And this group regularly, by video link, communicates with the rebel groups. And on the evening that after MH17 came down, the Trilateral Contact Group actually did meet. And it was able to speak to the rebels by video link. And what was agreed upon at that time, this is quite important, is agreement to secure the site of the crash, to provide safe access to the site for rescue teams, national and international investigators, and for special monitoring mission monitors, and to cooperate with competent Ukrainian authorities on further practical questions in the course of the rescue operation. Again, we felt very privileged to have been there at the right time and to do the work that we did. And I just wanted to read a quote from you from the Dutch foreign minister at the OSCE Ministerial Council in December 2014. He said that without the efforts of the OSCE, the Netherlands would never have been able to make so much progress in repatriating human remains, personal belongings, and wreckage from the flight. Now, I also want to say that I'll end with this, if I can, on a very personal note, because this crash, this disaster, as any disaster, touches us in many different ways. And the crash site, arriving there and working there for weeks, was very, very heart-wrenching, the things we saw. In January, and I'll end on this note, I had the privilege of meeting one of the relatives for the first time from MH17, a very young, talented, impressive young man called Jordan Wither. His uncle, Glenn Thomas, was on the flight. Glenn Thomas, at the time, was a spokesperson for the World Health Organization. Like myself, a former journalist, and around my age as well, he was about to turn 50. Fun-loving, loved to travel, and his nephew Jordan appeared in a BBC documentary on MH17 and spoke very highly of his uncle, who, by the way, was on his way to that AIDS conference in Melbourne. And I just wanted to, as a kind of tribute to Glenn and also to the other relatives on the plane, just read couple of lines of what his twin sister Tracy had to say to him. Glenn, there was no uncle or brother like him in the world. He was the most generous, kind person who always thought about others first. He loved life and was doing what he does best, traveling. There's not a bad word to say about him. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for joining us today. I know it wasn't easy to be there in those first few days and those first few hours on the ground in eastern Ukraine. And people like Michael and other investigative journalists who risked their lives to be in the zone to report what was happening on the ground have really set the narrative and changed the narrative around the conflict in Ukraine and the narrative that the Kremlin media has been trying to put forth ever since. And I'd just like to point out that these investigative groups like Bellingcat, like Corrective, other investigative journalists have been tracking the forgeries that the Kremlin has put out, photoshopped images, etc., and revealing the truth behind this terrible tragedy. And so I'd like to ask Julia to come back up for a moment to set the stage and for our last two speakers.
So as Alina mentioned, the investigations that Bellingcat and Collective have been doing have been unprecedented in the sense that usually this kind of work, tracking satellite imagery, tracking troop movements or movements of military material, happen behind closed doors, and we just get the report at the end. This is in some ways an experiment that's being replicated in front of our eyes by people like Iggy and others. You're seeing this investigation kind of unfold in real time, very transparently. The thing, though, is that when you look at the information space, ever since the very first day, it's like people knew exactly what happened, and then very quickly the political narrative or the need for a political narrative kicked in, and both sides kind of dug in on what they thought happened or wanted to think happened. And in that sense, the work of people like Rudy and Simon have been extremely important in that just constantly bringing the narrative back, not to, whether or not satellite imagery was doctored or not, but to bodies in the field falling, or falling on people's roofs, to guidebooks to Bali scattered in the fields, or children's books, luggage, just constantly bringing us back to the very real human cost about the fact, as Simon said in one of his reports in Russian Roulette, that this tragedy brought the conflict that everybody was trying to kind of sweep to the side of their consciousness to the doorstep of the international community, to realize that they had to do something about this, that they had to pay attention, because it did, in a very strange, bizarre way, a year ago, affect them as well. So I'm going to introduce Simon Ostrovsky, who's an award-winning documentary journalist. He has spent the last year, more than a year, doing Frontline reporting for Vice out of Kiev and the Donbass, doing absolutely incredible work, indispensable work. So, Simon.
Thanks. Thank you, Julia. I just wanted to tip my hat to all of the people who did a lot of the investigations that made it possible for us to understand what's happened, because initially we came out there and we were just reporting what we were seeing on the ground, and it was really horrific, but it took all of those investigations that the Bellingcat did and Corrective and journalists from The Guardian and The Telegraph and all of the other newspapers out there who really put in a lot of work into piecing it together for us to have an understanding. And I think now we do have an understanding. And I want to say that, I haven't done any kind of an investigation on that level myself at all. But what we did do, and I remember the moment when it became clear to everybody that a plane had come down in eastern Ukraine, and what a shocking moment that was. I was on a train from Kiev to Kharkiv. It was one of those Hyundais that they have in Ukraine. That's a very modern train, and you can feel like in it, like you're in any part of the world. And you're just sitting there, you've got internet in this modern setting, and you're reading your Twitter feed. And there was something that came down about, you know, a plane crashing, and somebody said it was a Malaysian plane. And it was like one of those September 11th moments for me, really, because at first it just seemed so outrageous and ridiculous that I thought somebody was making a joke about the previous Malaysian airliner that had disappeared. Because earlier that morning, the rebels had announced that they'd downed a Ukrainian transport plane. I thought somebody was just making a sick joke about that. But very quickly we realized that, you know, this was a real incident, and we channeled all of our resources to get down there as quick as possible and spend the next few days there. But again, this was just on the ground reporting, and it told us what was happening at the time, but it didn't tell us, you know, the whole backstory of the book. We've never done an investigation like that. The only sort of, I suppose, little piece that we've been able to add to the general understanding of the whole story with the book was we've been able to confirm one of the SBU recordings that the Ukrainian security services made of one of the rebel leaders in the Lugansk People's Republic, a guy called Kazitsyn. He was a Cossack leader. He was recorded by the security services, and it's very hard to know whether you can trust some of the stuff that's being put out there on YouTube by the security services or anybody else. So I thought that, you know, it was an accomplishment to get in front of this guy and to have him admit that, yes, he was the person who made that phone call. And I think we can play it now. It's from one of the reports we did about MH17. It's just a minute.
И что он делал на территории Украины? Ну, значит, завозили шпионов, не знаю. Понял? Не будет так, сейчас война идет, блядь.
Вы, наверное, видели эту запись, которую СБУ выдавала за ваш телефонный звонок. Это правда были вы?
Я был, почему нет?
Ну, просто там в этом разговоре вы говорите о том, что сбит был, то есть непонятно был, кто был сбит, и что якобы там казаки как-то были связаны с этим.
Не, я не так говорил. Вот. Мне просто было данные, только самолет сбили, и мне просто дали данные, что сбить самолет, и подумал. Я просто сказал, что не хрен летать на территории, где идет война. Угу. Вот это мои слова. Вот и все.
А вы знаете, кто сбил?
Ракета.
Ну, кто это сделал, вы не знаете?
Ну, без комментариев.
So I want you guys to know that when I was doing that interview, I was terrified. Because we'd come in there with a Russian reporter, Peter Shelemovsky, who's a great photographer. And he introduced himself as being from the Russian publication that he sometimes works for, and I just sort of kept my mouth shut. And we were having a pretty innocent conversation up until that moment when we brought MH17 into the picture, and it was obviously something that he really didn't want to talk about. There's a bit of a pre-story about how we actually ended up there. I wasn't planning to see Kazitsyn at all. We were on our way to see another field commander who had recently started doing these people's courts where he was taking people accused of certain crimes, putting them in front of the townspeople and getting the townspeople to vote on whether they should be found guilty and executed, and then putting those videos out on the internet. Alexei Mozgovoy, who's in the neighboring town from Kazitsyn. They had a sort of rivalry going on, which I didn't know about at the time, and we were just driving through Kazitsyn's area when we were stopped at one of the Cossack checkpoints. And the Cossacks asked us where we were going, where we were headed. We told them we were going to see Mozgovoy, and we'd had an invitation from him to interview him about the people's courts. And they were like, no. Our commander, he's the stronger commander of the two. You really have to see him. He does all of the fighting. Mozgovoy just sits there and puts videos on the internet. You don't want to speak to him at all. I was like, well, we can come back and see your leader afterwards. He's like, no, you're going straight there. So literally, we were basically escorted with a van in front and a car in back full of armed Kazakhs from the checkpoint to an interview with this guy, which we had not planned on doing, who, to be honest, I hadn't even heard of except for because of this recording. And it sort of sunk in, I think, halfway into the interview that this was the guy that the SBU had recorded. So that's the story. That's the story of that. And the reason that I'm telling it is because, you know, this is just like one tiny fragment that gives us the overall picture. And what everybody else did who was on the ground and verifying the entire MH17 story with the book, all of the places that they visited, all of the people that they visited, all of the insane checkpoints that they went through, all of the angry townspeople that they probably had to confront, and fearful townspeople who probably didn't want to say what they'd seen. There must be 100 stories like mine that the investigators, the citizen journalists have gone through, and you know, I think we owe them all a big thanks for doing all of that. So that's what I wanted to tell you about today, about how difficult it is to work outside in eastern Ukraine, and to thank all of the people who've been involved in this investigation.
Up next, we're going to have Rudy Buma, who is at Nieuwsuur. Is that how you pronounce it? NewsHour. It's a Dutch public television program, and Rudy has reported extensively from eastern Ukraine and on the crash of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. He has also reported from Afghanistan twice and interviewed people like Desmond Tutu. All right.
Hello. Yeah, from early spring last year I've been reporting on the annexation of Crimea, the uprising in Kharkiv, and after that the separatists' first military successes in Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. And in February I reported from the DPR about the Minsk II agreements and then the fall of Debaltsevo. But of course, after a year ago I also rushed to the MH17 crash site after it was downed. Maybe you can play the video. And when I arrived there, I was especially struck about I don't see a video. Well, yeah. Yeah, this is the video I meant. When I arrived there, I was especially struck by the stories of the East Ukrainian villagers who are living around the crash site and often saw bodies falling on their roofs or in their gardens.
Там мужчина лежал, еще одна женщина. Ну и там мужчина вот по асфальте тоже порвал провода.
I recently visited the lady you saw briefly again. Her name is Marina, and she told me that after the downing of MH17, she was so traumatized that she had to take tranquilizers to be able to sleep. And when severe shelling hit her town a bit later, she fled to family elsewhere. Also, about 20 orphans playing soccer witnessed corpses falling on their playfield. Since the Dutch forensics didn't go to the crash area directly to recover the bodies, the rebels started to do so. And by then, the smell of the remainings lying in the field in temperatures over 90 degrees was getting unbearable. I've spoken to boys as young as 16 years old who helped firemen and mine workers recovering the often naked bodies.
Ну, ощущения неприятные были, конечно. Ну, тела, можно сказать, где были наполовину, где целые, где так, приблизительно целые.
Короче, там даже непонятно было по людям. Вообще, ну, куски мяса просто. Первый день тяжело было. А так потом нормально. Привыкаешь.
Emotions while reporting on the disaster never came so close to me as this time. As you know, almost 200 Dutch died aboard the Boeing MH17. Many of them coming from the town where all the TV networks like mine are based. And in a small country like the Netherlands, it seemed like everybody knew someone who knew someone on the flight. Colleagues and friends of mine had beloved ones aboard. One of my acquaintances had 4 beloved ones aboard, and at the time he was texting me to get first-hand updates on the situation at the crash site. Also, my cameraman, Emmy Award-winning Joris Hentenaar, had a friend aboard flight MH17. These are other pictures. Let me scroll to Rijn Spekken. This is the 31-year-old Rijn Spekken from The Hague. They're bereaved, would not be able to visit the crash area because of the war. Joris and I took sunflowers from the field around it back to the Netherlands. A Dutch floral artist made an artwork from it called Sunflower Bouquet. We donated it not only to Rijn's relatives, but also to almost 250 other bereaved across the world. This is in Australia. An exhibition on this whole process started yesterday in a museum near Amsterdam. The bereaved who opened the exhibition walked through. Joris and I tried to bring the sunflower fields of East Ukraine to the Netherlands, since the bereaved in the Netherlands still cannot go to the war-torn east of Ukraine. Only a few small body parts of Rijn Spekken were recovered and flown back to the Netherlands on one of the 10 impressive repatriation flights. But the relatives of this boy, Gary Slok, have nothing. Gary and his mother Petra made this picture of themselves after boarding on MH17. Petra was found, Gary was not. His father and stepmother waited in vain until the end of the identification process, the 1st of July, almost 2 weeks ago, a little bit more than 2 weeks ago actually. And last week they buried an empty coffin. His father told me he's jealous at other bereaved who do have some small body parts. I've returned to the crash site many times over last year. Reporting from there has not been easy because of the constant shelling. This is, for instance, a rocket crater right next to the rebel-occupied crash site. We've been caught in incoming shelling from the Ukrainian army as well as from the rebel.
Zoals je hoort zijn er inkomende mortieren hier. We liggen nu in dekking met de Oekraïners. Dit is het front. Vlakbij die school wordt er nu vuur. Het is inkomend mortiervuur.
We of course all know that the separatists started this war and Russia backs them. Your institute, Bellingcat and Simon Ostrowski all have put forward concrete proof for that. One of the reports Simon didn't mention is a splendid story about a Russian soldier discovered by Bellingcat online. He tracked him down back to Russia and also placed him in the east of Ukraine near Debaltsevo in February. You'll have to watch that report. Myself, I saw rebels in Donetsk wearing Russian flag tags on their shoulders openly for the first time 2 days after the crash of MH17. These guys, I'm not sure if you can see it, but where I'm here, they were pretty friendly actually, but a few others just before we made this picture, they forced us to delete footage. Otherwise they would, I quote, shoot our heads off. Recently, I stayed a night in a nuclear bomb shelter in the Avdiivka Koks factory on the Ukrainian side of the Frontline, only about 5 miles from the Donetsk airport. I believe the New York Times also did a story on it. The rebels, they shell it every few days. But despite the fact that several workers died after shelling over the last year, the 3,000 workers keep on producing coks for the metal industry. And many of them now actually live on the territory because in its bomb shelters it's safer than in the surrounding villages. The staff and the local authorities do complain that the Ukrainian army is hiding its artillery behind the plant, the hospital and the schools, making workers and civilians a target for the rebels. They say that their own army is ignoring their request to move its tanks to other positions. I've experienced other tragic results of the Ukrainian army striking back at the rebel territory. The central bus station in Donetsk being hit. People living in bomb shelters. Lots of kids too, like you can see here. It's in Donetsk. And civilian apartment blocks, hospitals, markets in the DNR being hit. DPR, you say, I think, being hit by rockets, and villages being totally destroyed in the crossfire. The war in the Donbass is a human catastrophe on both sides. Michael gave you some numbers on that. But apart from US weapon supplies and training, Kiev is still on its own fighting the Russian-backed separatists and the Russian soldiers. I believe the downing of MH17 has had a very limited effect on the development of the war in east of Ukraine. It did reshuffle international power politics, creating a new Cold War. Let me cite a Dutch professor on social administration who says that the Dutch, until a year ago, still seemed to think that our country just has to fight the water, and it seemed that other evil powers only existed abroad. But after the crash of MH17, my small country suddenly became part of a huge geopolitical crisis. MH17 could be for the Netherlands and Europe what 9/11 was for the US. The defense policy seems to be shifting, and our government tends to raise the defense budget after numerous cuts. And all European countries seem to realize that we have to upgrade intelligence and cooperate in foreign policy. But our government is very cautious not to blame the Russians as the suspects for downing MH17 at this moment. Our Prime Minister is also always pointing out that we have to wait for the investigation committee's report, which comes out the half of October. And yeah, as you know, probably that CNN claimed this week this investigation report will state that the rebels took MH17 down. I personally don't think that this report will state that, because the investigation team is just investigating the cause. And sources within the team also say that they're trying their best to keep the Russian investigators also involved aboard the team. Pointing out the suspects is the task of our public prosecutor, who runs its own investigation, which outcome is due later. As you probably know, our government suggested to install a United Nations tribunal for the prosecution, but Russia is blocking this. And many legal experts are also skeptic about such a tribunal for various reasons. Early June, I returned to the MH17 crash site with the father of victim Marijn Spekke, who I mentioned earlier. He met with a rescue worker and with the local mayors. Reggie touched the ground of the so-called burn site in Grabovo, where his son died. He laid down roses at the cross, which is supposed to keep evil out of the village.
De rozen ruiken heerlijk. De kleuren, er zijn 9 rozen voor de familie van Rijn en voor de familie van Desiree, zijn vriendin. En die ene roze roos is namens alle nabestaanden van de MH17.
Another bereaved 22-year-old man who lost his 18-year-old brother recently said to me that they say time heals all wounds, but after 1 year, this wound has not healed a bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rudy. As we know, the MH17 crash affected the Netherlands disproportionately. And thank you so much for all your reporting that you've done on this. So now we've had some discussions from all of our distinguished guests, and I'd like to ask all of them to now come up and have a discussion on the stage. So Julia, please, Simon, Iggy, Michael, Rudy.
Okay. I think this is a question for all of you guys. You know, it's exactly a year later, and I think unfortunately for most people outside of this room or outside the Netherlands or Ukraine or Russia, this anniversary barely registers. Just as the tragedy exploded into the world's consciousness, it also very quickly faded. Why is this? Why should the world keep paying attention?
You know, as spokesperson for the Special Monitoring Mission, it's one of the things, unfortunately, I struggle day after day more recently, is keeping Ukraine in the headlines. It's very important that the news media continue to cover the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, there's a lot of competition now with what else is going on in the world. But the worst thing that could happen right now if the world averted its gaze from the conflict there. In terms of the disaster itself, there's still quite a bit of interest. I think, you know, part of the problem we're finding, because we do as much as we can help facilitate access for journalists, and I've had the privilege of working with professionals like Rudy, for example, and because of the restrictions on access, it's becoming increasingly difficult for many journalists to access the area. I think Simon can talk about that too. But so we're doing whatever we can to get the information out of there through our daily reports, through spot reports. But as I indicated in my presentation, we are facing severe restrictions on access. I mentioned the jamming of our UAV, things like that. So hopefully this will lift and people will have more access. The other thing, of course, is that when we do report, there is, as everyone knows, a propaganda war going on, and it's amazing to watch whatever you tweet or post on Facebook, how things can be taken one way or the other, spun around, or misinterpreted. So the mission, as much as possible, I think one of our strengths is, and I don't mean to sound like a PR guy, but it really is the way I feel, is that part of our strength is our integrity and our transparency, and the fact that we only report what exactly we see with our own eyes and ears, and we try to stay away from speculation.
Yeah, I must say that because of the crash of MH17, I got the opportunity to report on the war in the east of Ukraine much more than I would probably have if MH17 didn't crash. So that's an advantage, you could say. It is getting more and more difficult to move around, as Michael was saying. I was there in June. And right now, you have to have, I think, 4 passes from both sides of the conflict to get around. And I was just talking about the Avdiivka Coke factory. To give you an example, to get there from Donetsk, which is probably 7 or 8 miles or something, to the Avdiivka Coke factory, it took me 5.5 hours to just cross the front line and all the checkpoints, especially the Ukrainian side is, of course, checking everybody very well now, big traffic jams at these checkpoints. So that's very difficult. One thing which has surprised me a lot, I must say, is something I referred in my speech, was that MH17 did not really affect the war much. I mean, the Kremlin has just kept on denying any involvement in MH17 as well as in the war in the east of Ukraine. And that's something scientists or people who know much more about politics than I do have to judge on. But that's something that surprised me a lot, to be honest.
But as a citizen of a country that, like Alina said, has been disproportionately affected, I'm sure it's still very much part of the discussion and the news metabolism in your country. Why should the rest of the world keep paying attention?
Yeah. As I told you, I mean, a lot of people in Holland are frustrated that our government and the investigation committee are so silent. They really want to hear something, to hear some news. And there's a lot of controversy about the fact that we're not hearing anything about that our Prime Minister is also so cautious to point anybody out as a suspect. But yeah, it's just a few months now. We will probably hear more about that. It's something that the Dutch really need, it seems.
Do you think that's because, if they come out and start pointing the finger, that it obliges them to a course of action?
Well, it does. So that's a new political problem which appears if they do so. Of course, it's a small country in the Netherlands. It's very difficult to deal with a big country like Russia. But even for Europe, it will cause a lot of problems to think about. I mean, would there have to be more sanctions? What way would we you've got the gas. You know, there's a lot of big issues which have to be solved. And so I think also a little bit our government is looking up to that problem. But on the other hand, of course, it's also reasonable to have the investigation committee work in peace.
Mm-hmm. We'll come back to the Dutch connection, but I think Iggy wanted to say something.
Yeah, so the question you asked was, why should the world not avert its gaze from MH17? And I think, you know, as Rudy talked about, you know, in the Netherlands, it was an extremely significant event. You know, it's a relatively small country with a relatively small population, and you know, I think a lot of people, you know, probably the majority of people know somebody who, you know, who was affected. I was in the Netherlands at the time. I was just living there for about a year, and you know, and even just being in the country, you could really feel how tragic it was. And I think that, you know, especially with the propaganda war that Michael has mentioned, the lies that Russia has been putting out, the Russian state and its media, the way I see it is that they're effectively, you know, denying the relatives, the friends of those who were killed, the truth, and they're denying them any kind of closure. And so, for this reason, it remains, you know, extremely important for the world not to avert its gaze, you know, and for people to, you know, try and get the answers, the full answers about what happened. And I think that, you know, as Rudy mentioned, that, you know, it's an extremely important event for Europe and for the Netherlands, and you know, definitely the world mustn't avert its gaze.
I don't think MH17 is going anywhere. I think right now it's the calm before the storm, because we're all waiting for these reports to come out, the two different investigations, the one into what happened and the one into who's at fault for what's happened. And once those things come out, then, you know, people are going to realize that the downing was Putin's Gaddafi moment, and it was the beginning of his isolation from the rest of the world. And it's a different story a little bit, because you can't isolate the entire country of Russia as easily as Libya was isolated for so many years. But, you know, the same emotion and desire to do so, I think, is going to be there once all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and all of the statesmen have to tell their publics that they believe that, you know, the Russian military was behind this. And so, you know, I think right now we're talking about it because it's the anniversary, but we're going to be talking a lot more about this down the line, I think maybe even for decades to come.
So, okay, so then what happens? You know, we have this proposal to create a tribunal to try those responsible. Russia's on the Security Council. That proposal is probably not going to go anywhere. So let's say the report comes out and says this brigade from Kursk was the one responsible. Mm-hmm. Then what happens?
Well, you know, even if there isn't a UN tribunal, and, you know, they can put it to a vote of the General Assembly, and Russia doesn't have a veto there, so there's still a potential for that to happen. But even if it doesn't happen, I think that most Western countries are going to stand by the findings of the Dutch investigators. I don't think they need a UN tribunal. I think the UN tribunal is needed for the Russian people, to be honest, because the trouble for them is that if there isn't a tribunal that they recognize, that points the figure at some specific actors, maybe down from the commander-in-chief to the people who push the button, then that sort of implicates the entire Russian people. So, you know, for ordinary Russians to be able to absolve themselves of this crime, they need a process which their country and they themselves can recognize as being an objective process. So I think it's very important for Russia primarily to have this UN International Tribunal.
And I just want to wind it back a little bit to the, you know, what actually happened that day a year ago. David of Corrective mentioned, you know, facts that everybody agrees on, that it was a book, that it was this and that. It seemed like from the very beginning the Russians were doing their utmost to make sure there was no facts that anybody agreed on, that there was, just constantly throwing in information, muddying the waters. How, I mean, all of you did investigative work on this. How do you, grasp at tangible things when the Russians are trying to make everything kind of disintegrate in your hands?
Something about it, it's pretty hard to check things. That's why I respect Bellingcat Corrective so much in these times, because especially in the Netherlands, it's hard to find people who are willing to talk on record, because everybody's involved in the investigation committee, it seems, all experts. For instance, the famous 21st of July press conference giving in Russia, in Moscow. You've got the radar images saying that there's a Su-25 jet fighter in the air. At the time, MH17 was downed. I tried for months to get a radar expert on the record, just looking at the image and saying something if it's genuine or not. And eventually, I got a few experts, also an Italian guy who seemed to be the European top expert on radar images, and it appeared that the points that the Russians point out as being the Su-25 is actually falling debris from MH17. It's as simple as that. But it was hard to make the story because of what I told you, that everybody's being silent at the moment. But if the investigation report comes out, probably things like that will become much more clear in a short time.
And I think they want to push that back as far as possible, because like you said, nobody wants to have to confront the fact that they have to somehow deal with Russia. And I also kind of disagree with the idea that this didn't change the course of the war. I think it brought a lot more unity in Europe for sanctions. And I think the threat of further sanctions definitely stayed Russia's hand in terms of maybe expanding the operation to other parts of Ukraine. We can never know that for sure, but I think there is a deterrent effect of the threat of greater sanctions, which was definitely buoyed by this tragedy.
You talked, Simon, about Russia's increasing isolation, and when CNN leaked the preliminary findings of the Dutch investigators a couple days ago, Первый канал, Russia's Kremlin-owned Channel 1, did an extensive report on it and said, and showed images again and video of that infamous press conference in Moscow at the Defense Ministry, and said, we trotted out all this information. We have concrete facts within days. We were so transparent. The West has nothing, has no proof, no evidence, nothing. How do you deal, and this gets back to my question about, facts everybody agrees on. How do you deal with the fact that you're dealing with something that's very quintessentially Russian, where you present evidence and they say, I don't see any evidence. Mm-hmm. So how do you, in all of your roles, which are very different, how do you deal with that?
Like with trolls,
the main trolls is like the Kremlin and their media apparatus, but
you could say in a way that they're winning the propaganda war, because they are, like you said, saying, hey, we presented all kinds of stuff and you didn't. For instance, everybody is screaming online, where are the American satellite images? Why don't we see them? Yeah, why don't they? Yeah, mm-hmm. That's amazing. Also in the Netherlands, a lot of Dutch critics are screaming this. Why don't you show the satellite images? And even until now, we don't know if our investigation committee actually has those images, because they're not commenting on that either. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely a very difficult thing.
Does the work of organizations like Bellingcat help? Do people in the Netherlands trust that?
Not everybody, of course, but I think a lot of people do, and I think it's been very important. Also, I've experienced that maybe Simon and I, as old school field reporters, discovered that there's a lot of people online who are doing things we're probably not capable of.
Totally.
Yeah, and that's very impressive. I think it's very good that we can help each other out. And for instance, they do the online research stuff, and then Simon goes back to Russia and the east of Ukraine to check those things on the spot. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in my investigation of the Russian soldier in eastern Ukraine, basically we shared photographs with Bellingcat, and they were like, "Oh, well, this photograph was taken here, here, and here," and I was like, "How did you do that?"
How did you do that, Iggy?
basically we deal with geolocation. So, going back to how do we know what's true? How do we know what's false? So for us, for example, verification is something we do to, if we find an image, we'll try and locate that exactly, or we'll try and look at what the actual original source of that was. So, a lot of the time when we deal with things that have been uploaded by the person who actually took the image, who had no idea it had anything to do with MH17, who's a real person, whose Instagram profile you can check out and look at their friends, that this is true, this is a primary source. And I think that, so for example, like the Russian propaganda and the Russian state media often toe out that line where, we've presented stuff and you haven't. Well, they've never actually really talked about anything that Bellingcat has presented in Russian media. That's an interesting thing. I mean, the day after my investigation on MH17 came out at Bellingcat, within about half an hour, a researcher on Russia Today added me on Twitter. And later that evening, they would, they had my article up on screen where you could see my name, but they would say, who is this person? Who is this anonymous person? Even though my name was there. And then instead, they started talking about Elliot and basically attacking him for, who pays you and so on. And, whereas we're all volunteers getting no money, and, Russia Today is an extremely well-funded organization. So I think, it's really very convenient for them to say, well, the West doesn't have anything when they've deliberately tried to confuse everyone and ignore everything else.
Michael?
If I could say something, as someone who deals with a lot of journalists from around the world, is that what we're really seeing a lot, what we hear from journalists is budget cutting, slashing of budgets in the newsroom. There is a lot of interest in Ukraine from a lot of the colleagues we work with, but as more and more bean counters move into newsrooms and foreign reporting budgets are cut, it's very difficult to do that sort of old school, if I can put it that way, investigative reporting. So I've talked to colleagues of mine in other international organizations, and I think there's a awareness now among us is that it's incumbent upon us almost to help facilitate the work of journalists by making it easier for them to go to the fields in which we operate, whether that's providing them with broadcast quality B-roll, with more briefings, things like that. But there are ways to get around those budget cuts. But it is unfortunately hitting very, very severely to many mainstream media.
And it's the
outlets.
opposite of what's happening in official Russian media. Their budgets keep going up and up.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of the investigative work going on many different issues around the world are done by chaps sitting thousands of kilometers away at their desk, going through trolls or going through geolocating, things like that. So there's no replacement, though, I must say, for that traditional gumshoe work that these two gentlemen do day in and day out. So again, anything we can do to help facilitate that is very important.
Mm-hmm. Simon, you mentioned that this would be some kind of process, accountability and process of judgment would be good for the Russian people. If you look at the Russian media space, not even since MH17 came down, but since the Maidan movement started, Russians have been getting a completely different picture, an entirely different. It's like they're, and you also mentioned Russia's isolation. Informationally, they're also becoming very isolated. And so if you look at, for example, the Первый канал, the Channel 1 report from a couple days ago, it's presented to Russia, like all of the stuff that Bellingcat does, like proving that satellite images are photoshopped, those corrections never run, on Russian TV. So how do you deal with the fact that as far as the Russian population goes, the Ukrainians shot it down with American help. And then they're trying to foist the blame on Russia. And there's pretty much nothing, even the OSCE is seen as, a Western ploy, a Western ploy to humiliate Russia, et cetera. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think there's people in Russia who will never want to understand or try to understand, and they've dug into their position, and that's that. And maybe I'm overestimating the power of a United Nations process of some kind. But I think the United Nations is something that the Russian government hearkens to all of the time, at least rhetorically, and talks about how it's an important institution to them, and they recognize it and want to be a part of it and love their veto in it, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying that suddenly, everybody's eyes are going to open, but at least there'll be a segment of the population which is following things that are coming from outside of the Russian media sphere that hopefully will get something out of it. And I think it would be important maybe to Russian future generations as well, if not now.
Anyone?
I can give you an example. Yesterday, Australian broadcaster aired a video made right after the crash by the rebels themselves, looking at the debris and commenting on that. And at the end of the clip, there's something about the Su-25 jet fighter, or at least a jet fighter. And we had my network had like a voice analyst look at it, and the video is not new at all. There's clips of that already aired by the BBC previously, and if you compare that, the analyst saying that this voice, this new voice, sounds like it's being dubbed because it's also more hollow. It could be recorded inside. So there's now discussion about the genuinity of it, and he's also adding that if it's dubbed, it's pretty unprecedented. I mean, these kinds of videos being manipulated in such a way is something we don't really know yet. It's pretty new. So the propaganda war Michael was referring to is getting pretty seriously if it's...
Mm-hmm. These fake experts, fake think tanks that the Russians are trotting out. Did you want to add to this?
Well, I think I'd say to that is that it just reminds us as the unique organization that we are. And by the way, I should remind people that we're unique in the sense that 57 participating states, which includes Russia, Ukraine, US, Canada, votes by consensus. Our mission was born by a consensus vote. The mandate was extended by consensus. So it is important to have these international bodies, these international instruments. I'm often asked why is Minsk dead, or is the ceasefire dead? And I say, well, my answer to that is that it's so crucially important to have a roadmap in place and to also have a forum for dialogue. The worst thing that could happen, of course, if there's no dialogue going on whatsoever, and if there's no roadmap in place. So part of our role, of course, is to help facilitate that dialogue. I mentioned the Trilateral Contact Group. Things are extremely fragile right now. There's a lot of trigger happiness. There's a lot of ammunition built up in the same place, heavy weaponry. Things are extremely, extremely tense. So that is why it's so important to have that dialogue facilitation in place.
I have one more question for Rudy, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Rudy, you alluded to this in your presentation about the political changes happening inside the Netherlands as a result of the MH17 crash. The Netherlands and Russia used to have a very close relationship, especially in the previous decade. So what was that reevaluation like, that process of reevaluation like politically inside the Netherlands?
I don't think you can see it yet, to be honest. As you know, in Europe we depend a lot on Russian gas. There's a lot of economical interconnections between Europe and Russia. We were pretty severe, and our Prime Minister also, of course, stimulated the economical sanctions right after MH17 a lot. But after that, like after the first month, nothing really happened. We have had our political interconnection with Russia, I think, in a pretty normal way. And I don't think you can see it yet. Referring to the defense budget and stuff like that, that has to be it's getting more clear in September when we have our new government budget presented. I think it's too early to say. I think it's interesting to see that our government is taking their hands off anything.
And what about man on the street? How do they view the Russians maybe before the crash and after?
I think I don't know exactly. The more interesting thing I find that there's also in Holland a group of people, and it's hard to say how big this group is because they're mainly online, which is like a libertarian right-wing blogger kind of group who are very much anti-European Union, and for that they seem to be pro-Putin. Yeah, so there's also within the Netherlands, despite the fact that a lot of evidence is piling up now against Russian-backed separatists, a lot of people who are actually criticizing us as the media and our government for being too anti-Putin.
All right, we'll open the floor up to questions. And let's make sure they're questions, not statements.
Steve Winters, consultant. This is for Michael from OSCE. Since you mentioned this a couple of times, it's kind of a minor point, but you talked about the jamming of your drones. So my understanding is there is a lot of jamming going on, but it's to mess up the targeting by the heavy artillery from the Ukrainian side so that they can't hit the rebel targets accurately. So do you see this jamming as just directed at you actually to somehow prevent what you're doing, or is it just sort of something that's taking place because jamming is going on to make sure people can't identify targets? It has really nothing to do with you directly.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, the jamming, I can tell you, has been going on for weeks, if not months, over wide swaths of territory controlled by the DPR. I believe it was in the past week that one of our drones actually spotted a jamming vehicle. And again, it jams the video feed, also confuses the GPS system, so our operators have to put it under manual control and fly it back. And it's not only that our drones have been targeted by jamming, they've also been targeted by live fire. So one of them is inoperable because of that. There's some anxiety, if I can put it that way, over these drones. I don't know if any of you remember, but once the big numbers of Australians and Dutch experts came into the MH17 site, the Australian Federal Police actually brought a drone with them so they could have an aerial eye in the sky. The rebels at that time that were in control of the crash site were so nervous about it, they didn't allow it into the sky. That thing never flew. So that was very unfortunate, because it was thought at that time that their drone could help spot human remains, personal belongings, that sort of thing.
We saw video drones today flying over Grabovo during the memorial, the local memorial, though. I'm not sure which network was able to put them in the sky, but Russia today is allowed by the rebels a lot of times recently to put video drones on targeted areas.
Ed Verona with McClarty Associates. John mentioned Igor Girkin in his opening remarks, but no one else has said another word about him. Could anybody say what has become of him? Has anyone done any further investigation of the communications between him and various other people after the incident?
I mean, as far as I know, I haven't met him personally in Moscow, but he's around and he goes to various fundraisers. He very rarely gives interviews to big networks, but he does give interviews to, nationalist-friendly sort of internet YouTube channel type stations, and quite often. I don't think he has any direct control over what's going on in eastern Ukraine anymore at all. I think he's been banned by the Kremlin from participating, and now he's just sort of a firebrand loudmouth who likes to criticize the Kremlin's policy for not expanding the war further into Ukraine.
We did track down Borodai, the prime minister of the republic at the time, recently. We had an interview appointment with him, and he was very friendly and open to give an interview, but we showed up, my colleague, the correspondent in Moscow, showed up twice at his office, but he was not there. And then a week later, I saw a picture in the newspaper of a colleague of mine, Olaf Koens, who's also a correspondent. And he bumped into this guy in a cafe.
Where opposition journalists hang out.
Yeah, so there was like 10 international journalists drinking beers, suddenly bumping into Alexander Borodai, and they made a selfie of the group. I think it was
It was a mini scandal, to be honest.
Yeah.
It didn't look very good, but in their defense, they were all drunk.
I'm Larion of Cato Institute. I have a couple observations/suggestions and one question. Observation one is just with enormous investigations that have been done by Bellingcat and Corrective, it does not look like that you have used the information that has been uncovered by Russian and Ukrainian bloggers. At least I haven't seen any reference, but this is enormous information has been some kind of found even just with very first few days after the tragedy. And I think for the overall picture, it would be extremely useful to combine what you have done with what has been done by Russians and Ukrainians bloggers, and would produce a really full picture. And it gives me maybe suggestion, Julie, to you, when you're saying something quintessential Russian, I think probably you had in mind quintessential Kremlin, just not to confuse Russians and Kremlin, okay? That's a very important difference. Not all Russians follow Kremlin. That's the point. Okay. Another suggestion might be you, because from your comments, seems to me, you said that the conflicts launched in April, which suggests that you would exclude Crimea fully. Occupation, annexation, and all this, what Simon has reported extensively from Crimea, which is not essentially correct, because war has been studied by, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, on February 20th. Look at the medal for return of Crimea.
Okay, let's keep it to a question.
Right, and the question is exactly what you have in the announcement, part one. Who shot down MH17? So we know who pushed the button.
So the question is, who shot down MH17?
No. You just let me formulate it, okay? We know who pushed the button. My question, just to make it more accurate, who gave the order to push the button? I would like to ask everybody.
I cannot answer that. I can't either, but I'll give you the answer I give journalists who ask me that, is that we'll wait for the investigators to come up with their conclusions on this.
I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to the fact that this book was provided by Russia, and a lot of circumstantial evidence that shows that you can't operate a book unless you've had a lot of training and
current training, like fresh training.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I think we can say that there's a lot of evidence pointing towards Russia. But I think the question of who gave the order, I don't know if necessarily there would have been an order. I mean, I wasn't in the book. He's sitting there looking at his little radar screen. He's got like 2 seconds to make a decision, and then he pushes the button. I mean, I suppose he had sort of general orders, whoever pushed the button, but I don't think he had a specific order. Then again, I'm just, pulling stuff out of the sky, so who knows?
Yes, to follow up on that point, I thought David Crawford's description of what it takes to operate these, and you have 40 seconds to make a decision. So my question is, and his comment that sooner or later this kind of incident would have probably happened, given the fact that the equipment was there and the amount of time you have to make a decision.
Well, according to an interview I saw on Russian TV yesterday with a Russian aviation expert, if you bring a book like that in isolation without the other parts of the echelon, which have radars that tell you exactly what you're looking at in the sky, then essentially you can't really know for sure what you're shooting at, and that it was pretty much criminal just to bring it without the rest of the equipment on its own. It can fire on its own and hit things clearly, but it's not as accurate. You don't see what's going on up in the sky as well without the other 5 or 6 or maybe even 7 pieces.
That's what the indications are right now, that it was not a complete book system with all the vehicles which are supposed to be there.
So my question is, we're not looking to necessarily put malicious blame on someone because of all these circumstantial, but we are looking for who is responsible. And most importantly, it's just like here in Washington, whatever scandal there is, it's the cover-up that becomes the bigger issue. So this incident took place, however you want to describe it. But the bigger issue is what happened subsequently in terms of access for the families and information and all of that. And is there a way to get the Russians to understand That's the issue.
What do you mean by access for the families?
Well, the cover-up. In other words, there was no access for recovery. In other words, the whole investigation and the subsequent dealing with the incident.
Yeah, well, I've interviewed rebel leaders a lot of times, and they have been saying from the beginning on that the crash site was open to anyone who wanted to go there, even armed Dutch forces, like armed policemen. I'm not sure if they actually showed up, they would have let them there, but that's definitely something they said for a long time. We have opened the crash site to all experts, but they didn't come directly. We had to do the dirty work, and in a way they're right in that, because the Dutch experts did not come directly after the crash because it was a war zone. Maybe they were a little bit afraid of what was going to happen. Also, they did not want to recognize the Donetsk People's Republic. There was this whole discussion about signing agreements to hand over the bodies and stuff like that. Michael knows more about, if they're truthful in that or not. But what I saw and what I heard from them was that they always, opened the crash site for at least journalists, but also for experts from the Netherlands.
Yeah, initially there were difficulties, as I pointed out in my presentation, and then there was a period where things had to be paused, and unfortunately that was when the large numbers of Dutch and Australian experts were already in Donetsk. A ceasefire was agreed to. We got the big numbers out there into the field. They maybe had a day or two of work, and then, shelling happens nearby. We had to leave. We don't know who broke the ceasefire. They know who they are. But I can tell you that there was a lot of concern for many weeks about shelling nearby. And, I think there was a lot of bravery demonstrated, too, by many of the experts. And I remember I wrote this in my CNN.com piece. The first day that the large number of Dutch and Australian experts came on the crash site, I think it was the Australian commander who said, treat every day in the field as if it's your last one, because the point there being is that we don't know how much time will be available to collect human remains, personal belongings. So it was a very difficult situation on many, many days.
Hi, Ruth Wedgwood from SAIS. One question. Is there any, I'm trying to think through what the purpose of this misfire could have been. Is there any use for a book other than shooting down aircraft? Is it a general artillery weapon? I'm just surprised again that Mother Russia would bring a book into the theater of conflict if its only purpose as a weapon system is to take down aircraft.
There was a lot of Ukrainian air activity in the area. They shot down a few planes previously. I think around that time, 10 Ukrainian Air Force, maybe even 14, I don't remember, but had been shot down, and they were bombing the area.
And the rebels didn't have any aircrafts themselves, so it was like a very necessary thing for the military to have such a weapon.
Yeah.
Not by book.
Excuse me?
But not by book. That's the only case of using book.
What do you mean?
It's another aircraft system that has been used before.
Yes, of course, they had man-pads.
It's not the only case of using book, so that the question is absolutely correct. Because it's only the first and the last case of using book in this conflict.
Well, actually, there were certain reports, there were suspicions that an MH17 was shot down.
It was different system, different altitude, and a different system.
Well, it was a different system because, as I know, even the Kiev government until now does not know what caused the Antonov to crash.
But nevertheless, it's a different story. There is no confirmation, there is no images, there is nothing.
Okay, all right.
Actually, sorry, I just also want to point out that going back to the original question, that there were numerous posts on social media on Corrective from local groups in the Snizhny Torres area, and there were suspicions sort of on the day, in the hours, preceding the attack, that there was people were suspecting that there was going to be a plane incoming. There was sort of a lot of chatter about people getting sort of excited that there might be another Ukrainian plane, or there might be some more bombing. And Bellingcat explored that and actually looked at the fact that there was a reason for the separatists to transport a Buk missile system into the area on that particular day.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Benjamin Haddad from the Hudson Institute. If you allow me, I'd actually like to take a little step back from the MH17 episode and ask you about the situation right now, and especially for those of you who still travel to the field regularly, what you make of the implementation of the ground of the Minsk II ceasefire agreements.
Well, as you know, there have been 2 rounds of Minsk, September and then in February. In February, very clear roadmap was outlined for everyone to follow. Most crucially, of course, was the maintaining the ceasefire, and also the removal of heavy weaponry. The ceasefire, as I indicated, and as my colleagues frequently say, is very fragile at the moment. We record many, many violations almost every day, pretty much every day. In terms of the removal of heavy weaponry, there were 3 basic steps there. One was to provide the OSCE, and this both sides were to provide the OSCE with an inventory of what they have, in other words, a baseline that we can work off of. Secondly was to advise us of the routes that will be taken to move the heavy weaponry. And thirdly, most crucially, is to identify where the storage sites are, where these weapons will be kept out of harm's way. The first point, giving us the inventory, we never, as far as I know right now, received the full information from both sides, and that's made the monitoring of the heavy weaponry very difficult. And then also, as we see in our daily reports, we go visit the storage sites on a daily basis, and oftentimes the weapons have been moved. And some of the excuses we get, well, they're being used in a parade, or they're being used on training. So that part is very difficult. And the other steps in Minsk, we haven't got that far yet. The other worrisome thing is, I've said this in a few interviews recently, is that we're also beginning to see training or firing ranges pop up on the rebel side, and they're also using weaponry there that is prescribed by Minsk. So it's a very difficult situation right now, and all the politics aside, again, we have to remind people that at the end of the day, it's the civilians that are really suffering. I mentioned the numbers to you before. And, I think the number I quoted from the UN was 2.3 million uprooted. That number is going up very quickly. I think in some weeks you have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people leaving the conflict zone for safer ground in areas controlled by the Ukrainian government. One last point on that is that after so many months of hosting these displaced people, you can imagine the strain that it's put on host communities as far as Lviv and Western Ukraine, on NGOs that are looking after these folks, on the social fabric of the country. And it does create tensions as well. For our part, we've done 2 things off the top of my head. Is one, we've done a thematic report on the situation of IDPs. And the second thing we do, for example, in Western Ukraine, is we try to hold roundtables or dialogues with people to help prevent tension from this new population configuration.
Maybe you can just illustrate it. I mean, Michael's the best on the numbers. The last trip I made with the relative you just saw on the screen was early June, and then the very day that we wanted to enter the DPR was the day that there was fighting going on in Mariinka, like a fourth town of Donetsk, and it appeared that it was like becoming this new Debaltsevo a bit. So all the Ukrainian checkpoints were closed actually that day, and we were not able to enter the DPR at all. At the end, we're finding a little hole, and we did enter it. But yeah, that day there was big fighting going on again, so it can shift very much day to day. And also in the factory I told you about, we went up to the roof of the highest building over there in the night, and you could actually see, in this case, the Ukrainians shelling Donetsk airport from there with heavy artillery. I'm not an expert on what kind of artillery, but it was like huge fireworks, you could say, that night. And that was just your average day.
Have you been back recently?
Not since a couple of months, so I wouldn't like to talk about it.
So if there's a, sorry, I'm just going to ask a follow-up question, but if there's all these ceasefire violations happening every day, all day, every day, again, is this to connect this back to MH17? you know, we don't say it's a ceasefire violation because then it would oblige us toward a certain course of action? Or, I mean, what is there a political decision there to not say that Minsk 2 is dead?
Well, you know, there are important forums, as I mentioned earlier. There's the Minsk meetings happening. We're involved in the security working group. Progress is slow, but again, talks are continuing. There's the Normandy format meetings. Again, it goes back to what we said earlier. It's very important that the world not avert its gaze from this conflict. I can tell you that at the often at the permanent council meetings of the OSCE, Ukraine is very, very much at the top of the agenda. Our Ambassador Apakan just reported earlier this week to the permanent council. And in very, I can say, I think in a very granular format with a lot of detail, because we are there on the ground in such numbers. I'd like to add another quick point, because we also have to look ahead too. One of the things we've been reporting on, which is very, very worrisome, is the buildup of unexploded ordnance. I mean, you can imagine after so many months of fighting how much there is concentrated. It's become a huge threat to civilians and to aid workers. And also the massive, massive destruction of infrastructure, bridges, roads, railways. I think the UN a few months ago, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, came up with a preliminary figure of the cost of reconstruction. I believe it was 1 billion plus, it'd probably be a lot more than that. But destruction of those bridges is also impeding the flow of civilians across the contact line, so that they can go into Ukraine proper and get their pensions, to get medical aid, things like that. It's a very, very complex, difficult situation.
Andrews, I think, had a question.
Anders Åslund, Atlantic Council. Wanted to follow up on Michael Bochirkov's statement here that there are 2.3 million people who have left.
1.3. 1.3, but
you said 2.3.
2.3 uprooted is the way the UN put it.
Yeah, but you have also people have 1.3 in Ukraine. Then we have people in Russia.
Yes.
You have normally two different numbers there, 500,000 or 1 million.
Yeah.
Both are even. And then normally you have 100,000 people going to other places.
Yeah.
How many people are left now? What is your assessment of that? Thank you.
Very difficult number to come up with, but let me answer it this way. You know, you've probably heard of Shirokine by now, the village to the east of Mariupol. Heavily shelled over the past weeks. We've been trying as much as possible to not only observe what's going on there, but also to arrange for the guns to go down for a ceasefire, so civilians can, you know, at least return. But in our most recent reports, that village is now empty, and this could have been avoided. We were also at the village closest to Donetsk Airport a few weeks back. I was there as well. It was virtually empty. In a lot of the settlements in eastern Ukraine, in rebel-held areas, you have villages that are almost deserted, and those that are left behind are unfortunately the most vulnerable, the elderly, those with physical disabilities, and also you see some children there. On that point, and I mean, I've worked a long time in UNICEF, and we have to also mention the toll it's taking on children in the conflict zone. The number that have been killed, the number that have been injured, displaced, and the psychosocial distress as well is absolutely huge. Even before the conflict, I think it's fair to say that you know, Ukraine wasn't very well set up to deal with that types of large numbers of distressed young people. So this is something that the international community could possibly help in dealing with that huge problem. You know, what children really want are a sense of normality. They want to play, they want to go to school, they want roofs over their head, and they don't want to hear shelling. I've worked a long time in Gaza and the West Bank, and I've seen the effect that this can have over a prolonged period of time. So it's a huge concern in Ukraine as well.
So looking forward, I mean, you mentioned these deserted villages. Looking forward, you know, what do you do with this region? It's been splintered off from Ukraine. Russia doesn't seem to be looking to absorb it. It doesn't really have the money anymore to do so. You know, this is a question to all the panelists. How do you see this unfolding going forward, and what do you do with the Donbass?
Well, first to illustrate Michael's numbers also, again, in February, I think the clip you saw us diving into the snow was in a village called Nikishino near to Debalchevo. And I think it's a village of 1,000 inhabitants, and at that time there were only 5 families left. And the rest of the village was totally, but completely shot apart. I mean, the Ukrainians have stayed on the one side of the village for a few months, and the rebels on the other side. And in the crossfire, there was just not one house being unharmed, and that's really, really terrible to see. And I think it's very difficult, of course, to build up villages like that in the near future. Talking about the children, I also made a report about the Donetsk Opera House, who is actually still running operas for children all during the war, which is like very strange to see, of course, playing Cinderella when the rockets are flying over your city. But to answer your question about the next future, I mean, so many people fled. Economy is obviously not. The economy of the Donetsk Republic is obviously not able to stand for a long time, because there's no money flooding anymore from Kiev, no pensions, the whole coal minery industry is just on a standstill. So I'm very curious how long they will be able to survive being independent and not being funded from Russia.
Well, I did a 23-minute long report specifically about Russia's involvement in eastern Ukraine, so that I could say that Russia is involved in eastern Ukraine and not have to cage that with anything. I know that there are Russian soldiers ordered by the Russian government who have been sent to eastern Ukraine, and I think the answer for what happens in the Donbass lies with Russia, and so there needs to be pressure on Russia if this conflict is going to end, and you can't fix the Donbass until the conflict is over. It's up to Russia to end the war there. So I think all measures should be towards pushing Russia towards ending the war, because it has to come from them.
We've spoken to many internally displaced people being housed in places like Dnipropetrovsk and Kramatorsk, and the one thing that they always repeat to us is when you ask, when are you going to go home, or do you want to go home, and they don't want to go home until the shelling stops, until they're assured that their kids won't be killed by live fire. The second thing, as I mentioned earlier, there's a huge effort to demine bridges, roads, railways. It's an enormous threat right now. It's very expensive to do so. You need a lot of experts there on the ground. Once again, that would be a role that the international community could fill in once access becomes possible in those areas.
Do we have time for more questions? I don't know how we're doing on time. Nobody? Okay, all right, we have 5 more minutes. Go for it.
My name is Yaroslav Martinyuk. I'm formerly with the Radio Liberty. My question is for Rudy. I'm still perplexed, puzzled by the Dutch government's reaction to the downing of MH17. Is there not a realization in the Dutch government that by being ambiguous, they are complicit in Russia's denial, cover-up, lie of everything that's happening?
It's very difficult to answer that, because I can't look into the souls and the minds of our government. So yes, what's definitely happening is that they're trying to distance them from, blaming the Russians at this point. Why they're doing that, and
speculate?
I don't. As a journalist, I don't like to speculate too much, to be honest. But there's definitely a lot of criticism at the Dutch government. I mean, at first, after there's been some surveys of a university. Judging how if our politicians are trusted last year, and just after MH17, when they brought the bodies back, and there were very good, respectful repatriation missions and stuff like that, it was increased a lot. So first it was like 40% of the population trusted the government, and then it was 60%, something like that. After that, when things like this started to happen, it went down again. So during the last winter, the trust in our government went down again on this issue also. But why they are doing this, I can't tell you.
I think it would be obviously quite difficult for the Dutch criminal investigation to take place, and if you want the government to actually pick a side before the investigation is completed, I mean that seems that doesn't seem productive for the government to basically claim that one thing is set and then to have an ongoing criminal investigation. So I think it's
The one thing I did say in my speech was that there's Russian investigators in the investigation committee, and if our government would say right now the Russians are to blame, they would probably leave the investigation committee directly, making to speculate a little bit, making let's say relations already a lot harder, and also making the investigation itself more difficult right now. Because you want to have like all parties aboard during the investigation to be able to access all the sites you want to go, and to also, you're very disappointed, I can see.
All right. Thank you so much to all our panelists. This was very interesting. Thank you to Atlantic Council for hosting this. I think we're going to do another question? Okay. All right.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. There's one thing I wanted to point out. There's going to be a memorial march for the victims of the shoot-down today at 5:30, starting in Lafayette Square and going to the residence of the Russian ambassador, just so everyone knows. Thank you.